You don't know what you've walked into, I whispered to myself as the rain hammered the streets, turning every puddle into a mirror of flickering streetlights and neon signs. Emma Carter's hands trembled on the wheel of her battered Honda Civic, knuckles white as she navigated the slick asphalt, her heart thudding in time with the wipers slapping against the windshield. Every corner seemed sharper tonight, every shadow heavier, and she could feel eyes on her even when the streets appeared empty. A flash of headlights reflected in the rearview mirror, and she caught a glimpse of a black SUV approaching fast, tinted windows reflecting the chaos of the storm like shards of broken glass. Emma's mind raced, thinking about deadlines, overdue rent, and the pile of textbooks weighing down her backpack, but none of it mattered now. The tires slipped slightly as she braked for a puddle, sending the car fishtailing, and the world tilted for a second before impact, a metallic crunch that reverberated through her chest. She froze, heart hammering, before the doors of the SUV opened and Dominic Romano stepped out, towering and impeccable in a dark suit, water rolling off the tailored fabric, yet not a crease in sight. His eyes, an almost unnatural shade of ice blue, locked onto hers, a silent claim that made the rain seem to pause, the city dim around him. "You're mine now." His voice was low, measured, yet each word hit like a strike, and Emma's first instinct was to flee, but the puddles betrayed her steps, slowing her escape, turning each movement into a careful negotiation with gravity. Men in black suits emerged from the shadows around him, not threatening, yet undeniably present, forming a boundary she instinctively understood. Dominic's gaze never wavered, not once, a paradox of danger and calm, and despite the fear, Emma felt the faintest edge of reassurance, a promise that this man, though powerful and untouchable, might also protect her in ways she hadn't yet realized. She stumbled back against the curb, raindrops plastering her hair to her face, the chaos of the collision and storm blending into a surreal tableau, every flash of lightning illuminating Dominic's measured movements, his silent assessment of her. Her breaths came in shallow bursts, eyes darting between the SUV, the men, and the man who now dominated the frame of her world. She wanted answers, a reason for this sudden intrusion into her life, but words stuck in her throat. Dominic's hand moved, just a fraction, but enough for her to notice, a subtle gesture that held authority, restraint, and intention all at once, and the storm around them seemed to grow quieter, leaving only the sound of her heartbeat and the weight of his stare. Emma's mind raced through escape routes, excuses, reasons to run, but each thought collided with the undeniable magnetism of his presence, a silent demand for attention she couldn't ignore. The rain fell harder, pattering against her shoulders, and as Dominic took a step closer, the energy between them condensed into a single, almost tangible pulse of anticipation, the city fading into the background. "Stay," he said, though his lips barely moved, yet she heard it in every beat of her own chest, and in that moment, Emma realized the night had changed everything. A door had opened she could not yet understand, and behind the eyes of Dominic Romano lay secrets and power she had only begun to glimpse, the storm outside no longer the threat, but the stage for what was about to unfold. Emma Carter barely registered the sharp smell of wet asphalt as Dominic Romano guided her toward the sleek black SUV, the raindrops dripping from the edges of his suit like falling crystals, and each step he took seemed to command the city itself to pause. Her chest heaved, breaths short and uneven, yet she could not look away from the calculated intensity in his ice-blue eyes. The door opened, inviting her into the warmth and silence of the vehicle, a stark contrast to the storm that still pounded the streets, and she slid in, feeling the plush leather against her palms, the smooth interior swallowing the noise of the world outside. Dominic closed the door behind her with a soft click that somehow carried authority, control, and the weight of expectation. He did not speak at first, letting the silence stretch, a quiet that made her senses sharpen, her thoughts racing in the gaps between the faint hum of the engine and the soft patter of rain against the glass. She tried to measure her words, to find some footing in this sudden shift, yet every instinct warned her that nothing about this encounter was ordinary. Dominic glanced at her, his expression unchanging, yet his eyes flicked briefly to the rearview mirror as if monitoring an invisible threat, then back to her with a steadiness that both unsettled and intrigued her. "Where do you think you are going now?" he asked finally, his voice low, calm, but with an undercurrent of command that made it impossible to answer casually. Emma opened her mouth, closed it, and finally whispered, "I do not know," realizing that the truth of her confusion, her fear, and the disorientation was precisely what he expected, and perhaps what he wanted. The SUV rolled forward smoothly, each turn precise, navigating through glistening streets illuminated by neon and traffic lights that blurred into streaks through the rain-soaked windows. And with every block, Emma felt the weight of the encounter settle deeper, pressing against her chest, a mixture of awe and trepidation. Dominic spoke again, softer this time, almost conversationally, yet each word carried intent. "You will see why it is important to trust what you do not understand yet." And Emma's mind reeled, imagining all the reasons she should question him, the life she could return to, the safety she might have abandoned in a single, chaotic moment, and yet the warmth of the leather, the rhythm of the SUV, and the quiet authority in his presence pulled her into a strange sense of temporary safety. Outside, the storm began to ease, leaving the city dripping, shimmering under streetlights. But inside, time seemed suspended between raindrops and headlights, her pulse sinking with the soft hum, her mind spinning through the possibilities of who Dominic Romano truly was, what his world held, and why. Against every rational thought, she felt compelled to follow him further into this unknown night. He glanced at her once more, a subtle lift of his eyebrow, an acknowledgement of her racing thoughts, and Emma realized that she had crossed a threshold she could not yet name, the road ahead uncertain but irrevocably hers to travel. And as the SUV moved through Manhattan, the city blurred outside, leaving only Dominic, the storm now a whisper, and the taut, unspoken understanding that this night was merely the beginning of everything she had not yet imagined. The SUV turned off the main avenue onto a quieter street, slick with rain and gleaming under the glow of scattered streetlights, and Emma Carter could hear the soft hum of the engine mixing with the distant wail of sirens, a city soundtrack that seemed both distant and intimately close. Dominic Romano's eyes were fixed ahead, calm, precise, yet she felt the intensity in his gaze even through the side mirror, a presence that seemed to fill the space around her. She shifted slightly in her seat, fingers brushing the smooth leather, mind racing with questions she did not dare to ask aloud, every instinct on alert, while part of her wanted to sink into the strange safety that seemed to radiate from him. "We will be arriving shortly," he said without looking at her, voice steady, carrying authority without the need for force, and she realized that the words themselves were a command disguised as information. Emma tried to process the swirl of emotions, fear, curiosity, uncertainty, and something more tentative, an unspoken acknowledgement that she was being observed, understood, and, in some ways, protected, yet every sense screamed that she was navigating a world far larger than her own. The city outside blurred past, reflections of neon and streetlights stretching like liquid ribbons across the wet pavement, and she found herself caught between the pull of the ordinary life she had known and the gravity of this new reality that Dominic represented. As the SUV pulled up in front of a tall building, modern and imposing, the kind of architecture that suggested careful calculation and absolute control, she noticed the security cameras, the sleek design, and the silent presence of discreet personnel, and a shiver of anticipation ran through her. Dominic stepped out first, umbrella in hand, rain dripping off the edges, and gestured for her to follow, each movement measured, deliberate, a silent choreography that communicated both safety and command. Emma slid out of the SUV, her shoes clicking softly against the polished pavement, rain soaking through the edges of her coat, and she felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly even as her heart continued to race. "Inside," he said, and the lobby greeted them with soft lighting, the subtle scent of polished wood and leather, a quiet sophistication that contrasted sharply with the chaos of the storm outside, and she realized that every detail was intentional, a reflection of the man who had chosen this place, this moment, and now her. She followed him down a long hallway, observing the small details, the framed artwork, the precise alignment of furniture, the faint echo of their steps, each element reinforcing a sense of order and control, a world she had never entered before. Dominic paused at a door, turned to her, eyes briefly meeting hers, ice blue and unreadable, and she sensed a weight in that glance, an unspoken question and expectation, as if the next choice, the next step, belonged to both of them. She swallowed, taking a breath that trembled between fear and intrigue, and realized that this night, these steps, and the presence of Dominic Romano were only the beginning of a journey she could not yet fully comprehend, the doors opening before her a promise, a mystery, and a challenge all at once. And as she stepped forward, the soft click of the door closing behind her marked the first moment she understood that her life had shifted into a rhythm dictated by another, a rhythm that demanded attention, awareness, and a courage she had not yet measured against the man who now led the way. Emma Carter stepped into the expansive office, the soft glow of recessed lighting reflecting off the polished hardwood floors, and for a moment she paused, taking in the sheer scale and precision of the space. Every detail, from the neatly aligned books on the shelves to the subtle scent of leather and cedar, spoke of order and control, a world completely unlike the chaos of her own life outside these walls. Dominic Romano moved ahead of her, confident, measured, every step echoing lightly, and she felt the weight of his presence guiding her path. He did not speak immediately, letting the silence stretch, a silence that felt loaded with expectation, authority, and a subtle tension that made her pulse quicken. Emma's eyes roamed over the room, noting the small, deliberate touches, the placement of a vase, the angle of a lamp, the faint hum of an air purifier that seemed to maintain an almost imperceptible calm. "Sit," Dominic finally said, gesturing to a leather chair near the large window overlooking the city skyline, and she obeyed, her hands resting tensely on her knees, the storm outside now a distant murmur compared to the intensity within the room. He remained standing, shoulders squared, gaze unwavering, and Emma felt the unspoken gravity of the moment pressing against her. Each breath she took seemed amplified, every subtle movement of her body registered, as if he could read her thoughts in real time. "You have questions," he said, his tone even but firm, and she nodded, words caught in her throat, the complexity of everything leaving her momentarily speechless. Dominic stepped closer, placing a hand on the corner of the polished desk, his presence commanding the space around her without a single word of threat, and yet it was impossible to ignore the undercurrent of expectation that ran through the room, a mixture of authority and careful calculation. Emma's mind raced, thinking of all the possibilities, the choices she had not yet made, the boundaries she was now stepping into, and she realized that every instinct she had, every lesson from her ordinary life, was being measured against someone who seemed to operate on a level she could barely comprehend. He spoke again, softly this time, a slight inflection of curiosity threading through his composed voice. "You will learn that understanding comes with patience," and she absorbed the weight of his words, recognizing that the journey she had been thrust into required not only courage but observation, awareness, and an openness to a reality that existed beyond her familiar world. The rain had slowed outside, leaving glistening streets that reflected the city, lights in fractured patterns, but inside, time seemed to stretch, each second weighted, purposeful, and charged with unspoken significance. Emma took a shallow breath, letting her fingers brush the leather of the chair, grounding herself in the tangible while her mind spun through the abstract possibilities of Dominic Romano's world, his expectations, and the subtle promise in his presence that indicated she was only at the beginning of understanding the gravity, the power, and the choices she now faced in this intricate, controlled environment. Emma Carter followed Dominic Romano through the quiet halls of the building, the soft click of her shoes on the polished floors echoing faintly against the walls, blending with the distant hum of city life outside. Each step seemed deliberate, measured, as if the space itself responded to his presence, shifting subtly under his influence. The lighting was warm, casting long, soft shadows that danced across the artwork lining the walls, highlighting intricate details that suggested both taste and intention. Dominic moved ahead with effortless control, yet there was a subtle awareness in his posture, a careful assessment of her reactions, and she felt the weight of his gaze like a steady pulse that kept her alert and conscious of every movement. She adjusted her coat, fingers brushing the smooth fabric, heart racing yet strangely attuned to the rhythm of the space around her, the quiet punctuated by the occasional soft hum of an air conditioning vent and the subtle whisper of the city rain sliding down the windows. Dominic paused at a large glass panel, hands resting lightly on the frame, eyes flicking briefly to hers before returning to the cityscape beyond, a moment that communicated more than words ever could. Emma inhaled slowly, the scent of polished wood and faint cedar filling her senses, grounding her in the reality of the room even as her mind whirled with the unspoken possibilities of the night ahead. "Observe," Dominic said softly, voice low and deliberate. "Understand the space before you react." And she nodded, realizing that the lesson was not just about the building or its layout, but about him, the world he inhabited, and the control he exerted effortlessly. Her gaze swept the interior, noting the alignment of furniture, the placement of decorative objects, the subtle lighting that created layers of perception, and she felt a mixture of awe and tension, understanding that every detail mattered and that her own instincts had to adapt to the rhythm he set. The city lights flickered through the glass, casting fractured patterns across the floor, creating a shifting map of illumination and shadow, and she moved carefully, each step deliberate, mimicking the calm precision she observed in Dominic. He turned slightly, allowing a faint smile to touch his lips, not directed at her, but at the harmony of the environment, and she felt a quiet pull of curiosity and attentiveness, realizing that being in his world required observation, patience, and an awareness of both the subtle and the overt. Emma's mind raced with possibilities, questions forming and dissolving like mist, yet the presence of Dominic, steady and commanding, anchored her focus, shaping her understanding of the choices and paths available. And as they approached the end of the hallway, she sensed the significance of each step, each pause, each unspoken signal, knowing that the night was unfolding in ways that would reveal not only the extent of his influence, but also the depth of her own resilience and capacity to navigate a world far beyond anything she had known before. Emma Carter followed Dominic Romano into a large room where floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the city skyline glimmering with countless lights, rain droplets still tracing faint trails across the glass, and she paused, momentarily overwhelmed by the vastness and the silent power the space exuded. The room was furnished with a careful precision, each piece of furniture aligned, polished surfaces reflecting subtle light, the scent of leather and cedar mingling with the faint hum of the city below, creating an atmosphere that was simultaneously calming and imposing. Dominic moved ahead, calm, deliberate, yet Emma could feel the undercurrent of his control, the way he seemed to measure every reaction she had, every slight intake of breath, and she became acutely aware of her own tension, muscles coiled, senses sharpened. He gestured toward a seating area with a quiet authority, and she stepped forward, noticing the subtle details that spoke of both sophistication and intention. The careful placement of books, the angle of the lamps, the soft glow of sconces on the walls. Dominic settled into a chair, his posture impeccable, and she found herself mimicking the restraint he exuded, sitting with hands clasped in her lap, observing, absorbing, trying to understand the rhythm of this new environment. "This is a world built on observation," he said, voice calm but deliberate, and she nodded, realizing that each detail, each shadow, each measured movement around her was part of a language she was only beginning to comprehend. Emma's mind raced, thinking of the possibilities, the choices she might have, the boundaries she had yet to understand, and she realized that the city beyond these walls, the storm, and even the night itself were now distant compared to the gravity of the space and the man who navigated it with such effortless command. Dominic's gaze flicked to her briefly, ice blue eyes assessing, measuring, yet without judgment, and she felt a strange mixture of reassurance and anticipation, understanding that being here required attentiveness, patience, and awareness of both subtle and overt cues. The hum of the air conditioner, the faint echo of their footsteps on polished floors, and the distant shimmer of city lights created a rhythm that drew her focus inward, making her acutely aware of every detail, and every thought racing through her mind. Dominic spoke again, softly. Learn to see what is not immediately obvious. And she understood the lesson was layered, about perception, patience, and trust, a subtle orchestration that required her full attention. As she shifted slightly, the leather beneath her hands firm and cool, the glow from the skyline framing her silhouette, she felt the first true sense of belonging to this space, not as a guest, but as someone being introduced to a world where observation, awareness, and understanding were the keys to navigating a realm far beyond her ordinary life. And as she glanced toward Dominic, poised and composed, she realized that each step she took from this moment forward would carry weight, significance, and the beginning of a journey into the depth and complexity of the man who had chosen to guide her through it. Emma Carter lingered near the window, city lights reflecting in her wide eyes as Dominic Romano stood across the room, the faint hum of the city below mixing with the quiet rhythm of their shared space. She felt the tension and control in the room, a gravity that seemed to pull her forward even as uncertainty and caution wove through her thoughts. Every detail was deliberate. The placement of the furniture, the subtle shifts in lighting, the way Dominic moved with precision yet left room for observation, and she became acutely aware that she was not simply being shown a place, but being guided into understanding a world she had never seen before. Dominic's gaze met hers briefly, a sharp, measured look that seemed to weigh her responses, her posture, the subtle catch in her breath, and she sensed a challenge in the quiet of his presence. Focus on what is unseen, he said, voice low, controlled, almost a whisper that carried authority, and she absorbed the words, realizing they were both instruction and test. The hum of the room, the soft ticking of a clock somewhere beyond sight, and the distant sound of traffic created a layered environment where every movement mattered, and Emma felt a strange thrill at the realization that she was participating in a silent exchange, a balance of observation and understanding. She adjusted her coat, the fabric warm against her skin, and noted the careful organization of objects around her, the symmetry of the room, the subtle way light and shadow were arranged to guide attention, and she began to understand that Dominic's influence extended beyond presence into the environment itself, shaping perception, expectation, and response. Her pulse quickened, a mixture of excitement and tension, as she realized that she was being drawn into a rhythm of attention, patience, and awareness, a subtle orchestration that required her full focus. Dominic moved toward the desk, fingers brushing lightly against the polished surface, and she followed with her eyes, noticing the deliberate control in every gesture, the quiet authority that did not need to be spoken aloud but resonated through the space. She felt the weight of the night, the storm now distant but mirrored in the intensity of the room, in the calculated movement and silent command Dominic emanated, and she understood that each moment here was a lesson in perception, trust, and presence. Emma exhaled slowly, the sound mingling with the hum of the city, and she realized that the next steps, the choices she would face, were framed not just by the physical space but by the careful, deliberate influence of the man who guided her through it, a world where observation, restraint, and awareness determined not only understanding but the rhythm and possibilities of what could unfold next. And as Dominic turned slightly, offering a glance that combined assessment and expectation, Emma felt the full weight of being present in a space meticulously curated for control, focus, and subtle revelation. Emma Carter stood near the wide windows of Dominic Romano's office, city lights flickering in the distance like scattered stars, and she could feel the weight of the moment pressing gently against her chest. Dominic moved with calculated precision across the room, each step echoing softly against the polished floors, his posture relaxed yet exuding quiet authority, and Emma realized that the way he carried himself commanded attention without a single raised voice. She adjusted her coat nervously, observing the subtle details of the space, the carefully arranged books, the faint glow of sconces, the soft scent of cedar and leather, and understood that every element had been intentionally placed, reinforcing the rhythm and control that Dominic maintained over this environment. "There are choices here," he said, voice even and calm, a slight inflection of curiosity threading through his measured tone, and Emma nodded, sensing that the lesson was both literal and figurative, about perception, patience, and awareness. The city outside shimmered through the glass, distant traffic and streetlights, forming a fractured map of movement, and each reflection seemed to emphasize the contrast between the chaotic streets and the controlled interior, a world meticulously curated for focus, observation, and understanding. Emma's heartbeat quickened slightly as she shifted, absorbing the lesson in real time, aware of the delicate balance between action and reaction, presence and observation, and the unspoken expectation that her attention and choices mattered in this carefully constructed rhythm. Dominic's gaze met hers briefly, ice blue and unreadable, and she sensed both assessment and quiet acknowledgement, a subtle challenge wrapped in calm authority. She exhaled slowly, letting her fingers brush the smooth leather of the chair, grounding herself even as her mind raced with possibilities and questions, each one layered with uncertainty and anticipation. The faint hum of the ventilation system, the distant murmur of the city, and the soft click of polished surfaces under their movements created a cadence that drew her focus inward, sharpening her awareness and compelling her to match the quiet precision that Dominic exemplified. He moved closer to the window, shoulders squared, eyes scanning the city beyond, and Emma found herself mirroring the careful attention he demanded, noticing the interplay of light and shadow, the reflections in the glass, and the subtle cues that shaped the environment. Understanding comes with observation, he said quietly, almost as if to himself, and Emma realized that being in this space required more than simply following. It demanded active perception, interpretation, and engagement with every nuance, a rhythm she was only beginning to learn. She took a tentative step toward him, matching his measured pace, feeling the weight of the night, the deliberate calm of the room, and the subtle pull of anticipation that threaded through the silence, knowing that each choice, each motion, and each glance would shape the unfolding of a night that was already charged with unspoken significance. And as Dominic glanced back at her, a faint, knowing expression crossing his features, Emma understood that the journey she had entered was just beginning, and that the space, the night, and the man who had brought her here held lessons she would need to navigate with care, attention, and the courage to observe beyond what was immediately visible. Emma Carter took a slow breath, feeling the subtle shift in the room as Dominic Romano moved toward a console near the window, adjusting the lighting so the cityscape outside glimmered with sharper contrasts, reflecting off the polished surfaces inside and casting long, intricate shadows that danced across the floor. She noticed the meticulous arrangement of objects, a crystal vase perfectly centered on a low table, books stacked with precise alignment, subtle decorative accents that emphasized symmetry and control, and felt the weight of the environment pressing a calm, yet deliberate focus upon her. Dominic's movements were quiet but authoritative, each step deliberate, creating a rhythm in the room that Emma found herself unconsciously matching. Noticing the slight sway of the curtains in the breeze from the slightly open window, the soft hum of the heating system, the distant murmurs of traffic, and how every element of the space seemed orchestrated to influence perception and attention. He turned, catching her glance with ice-blue eyes that held both scrutiny and patience, a balance of observation and expectation, and she realized that his silence was as instructive as his words, that the pause carried lessons about awareness, subtlety, and measured response. The smallest details are often the most revealing, he said quietly, voice low and steady, and Emma absorbed the cadence of the statement, understanding it applied to the room, to him, and to herself, and she felt a strange mixture of tension and curiosity, knowing that each movement, each glance, each microexpression could shift the perception of both observer and observed. She shifted slightly in her seat, feeling the smooth leather beneath her hands, the coolness grounding her as her thoughts spun through possibilities, each layered with caution and intrigue. Dominic adjusted a panel on the console, the click of mechanisms precise and quiet, and Emma felt drawn into a subtle rhythm, a dance of observation, awareness, and anticipation that held the promise of understanding yet demanded patience. The city lights outside flickered against the glass, breaking into a kaleidoscope of reflection and shadow, reinforcing the contrast between the controlled deliberate interior, and the vast, unpredictable exterior, and Emma realized that Dominic's influence extended beyond presence into shaping the environment itself, guiding perception and response without force. Her heartbeat aligned with the measured pace of the room, every sense alert, attuned to the smallest variations in lighting, sound, and motion, and she felt an awareness of her own role in this silent interplay, understanding that observation, patience, and careful attention were essential. Dominic's gaze met hers again, just a moment, ice blue and unreadable, yet carrying expectation and acknowledgement, and she knew that each choice, each shift, and each step she took from this point forward was part of a larger lesson, a progression through an intricate, controlled environment designed to teach, challenge, and engage her understanding of both the man and the world he navigated. Emma exhaled slowly, aligning herself with the rhythm he had established, the night stretching on with quiet intensity, and she felt the first subtle comprehension of the lessons embedded in presence, awareness, and attentive observation, knowing that the journey was only beginning and that the unfolding moments would require both patience and acuity to navigate the space and the man who now commanded it. Emma Carter remained seated near the window, hands lightly resting on her knees, the city skyline shimmering through the glass with reflections dancing across the polished floor, and she felt the quiet weight of Dominic Romano's presence as he moved deliberately around the room. Each step he took was measured, purposeful, yet there was an ease in his movements that suggested confidence without tension, a subtle command that made the space itself seem to adjust to his rhythm. She noticed the precision of every detail, the alignment of the furniture, the placement of objects, the way light filtered through the tall windows, casting intricate patterns on the walls, and she realized that each element was carefully curated, designed to draw attention, teach observation, and instill awareness. Dominic stopped near a side table, his gaze flicking to hers briefly, ice blue eyes assessing, observing, and she felt the intensity of that quiet scrutiny settle over her like a tangible presence, both challenging and compelling. Awareness is a skill cultivated, not assumed, he said, voice steady, low, and precise, and Emma absorbed the weight of the statement, recognizing that it applied not only to the room but to herself, to her ability to perceive, interpret, and respond thoughtfully in this environment. The distant murmur of traffic below, the subtle hum of the ventilation system, and the soft echo of their movements across the polished floor combined into a rhythm she could follow, a cadence of observation and attentiveness that seemed to pulse through the space itself. She adjusted her posture, shoulders slightly back, and felt her senses heighten, noting the faintest shifts in lighting, the angles of reflections, the quiet weight of the objects that Dominic moved around with a deliberate hand, each action carrying intent and control. Her mind raced with possibilities, the lessons implicit in each gesture and arrangement slowly becoming clearer, yet the complexity and subtlety of it all left her pulse quickened, a mixture of curiosity, anticipation, and the undeniable tension of navigating a world that operated on rules far different from her own. Dominic turned slightly, eyes briefly catching the ambient glow of the city, and she sensed both thought and expectation in his glance, a reminder that observation and awareness were the currency of influence here. The soft scent of leather and cedar enveloped the room, grounding her in the physical as her thoughts stretched to encompass the implications of her presence and the weight of each subtle cue, and she realized that every choice, every micro-movement, and every response would now carry significance. Emma exhaled slowly, aligning herself with the measured rhythm of the space, noticing how Dominic's controlled yet fluid presence shaped not only the room but the perception of everyone within it, and she understood that the lessons of attention, observation, and deliberate action were far from complete, the night unfolding with quiet intensity, anticipation, and the promise of insight into the balance between control and understanding, leaving her keenly aware that the journey had only just begun and that every step from this moment would reveal more about the man who guided her and the carefully constructed world she had entered. Emma Carter shifted in her seat, feeling the subtle energy in the room thicken as Dominic Romano moved with deliberate care to a set of shelves along the far wall, his movements precise, each placement and adjustment a quiet testament to control and intent. The city lights outside the tall windows cast elongated shadows across the polished hardwood, reflecting softly on the furniture and objects that were arranged with exacting attention. And Emma noticed the interplay of light and dark, the way reflections emphasized depth, perspective, and focus, subtly guiding her awareness. Dominic paused, glancing at her with ice-blue eyes that were calm yet penetrating, as if weighing her responses, her posture, the slight rise and fall of her chest, and she felt both scrutinized and observed in a way that demanded presence without pressure. "Every motion has meaning," he said quietly, voice low and even, each word deliberate, drawing her attention not just to the objects or the room, but to the rhythm and flow of awareness itself. And Emma realized that the lesson extended beyond observation into understanding subtlety, patience, and anticipation. Her fingers brushed lightly over the smooth leather of her chair, the texture grounding her as she absorbed the weight of his presence, noticing the faint hum of the ventilation system, the soft echo of her shoes against the polished floor as she adjusted slightly, and the muted glow of the city outside that formed fractured, shifting patterns across the room. She felt a curious mixture of tension and intrigue, understanding that Dominic's influence extended into shaping the perception of space, guiding attention and subtly encouraging reflection, and she followed his cues unconsciously, letting her posture, gaze, and focus align with the rhythm he set. The quiet cadence of their movements, the gentle shift of shadows, and the precise alignment of objects created a dynamic environment that required attentiveness, and she felt her senses sharpen, pulse quickening with anticipation and heightened awareness. Dominic's gaze returned to her briefly, a flicker of acknowledgement in his expression, and Emma understood that this moment was not simply about presence, but about attunement, observation, and engagement with the subtle currents of the space and the man who navigated it effortlessly. She exhaled, small, deliberate breaths filling the quiet room, absorbing the lessons implicit in the careful choreography of movement, placement, and observation, recognizing that her understanding of both the environment and Dominic's expectations would grow through continued attention. The soft, consistent hum of the room, punctuated by faint city sounds, became a background rhythm that drew her awareness inward and outward simultaneously, and Emma realized that each micro-movement, each thoughtful observation, and each deliberate choice would shape her experience in this meticulously constructed space. And as Dominic adjusted a small decorative element on the shelf with subtle precision, she felt the first true comprehension of how control, observation, and measured awareness intertwined, guiding her focus and preparing her for the decisions and understanding that lay ahead in the quiet intensity of the night. Emma Carter felt the quiet intensity of the room shift as Dominic Romano moved closer, each step deliberate, measured, exuding calm authority that seemed to draw the very air into his orbit. The city lights shimmered through the tall windows, fractured into a pattern of reflections that danced across polished floors and the meticulously arranged furniture, and Emma could not help but notice how every detail of the space had been curated to guide focus and perception. Dominic stopped near a console, glancing at her briefly with ice-blue eyes that assessed, weighed, and acknowledged in a single sweep, and she felt the subtle pull of anticipation tighten in her chest. "Understanding requires commitment," he said, voice low, precise, carrying an undercurrent of expectation without pressure, and Emma absorbed the weight of his words, realizing that the lesson extended beyond the physical environment to her own awareness, judgment, and perception of subtle cues. She shifted slightly in her seat, fingers brushing the leather of the chair, grounding herself as her mind raced through possibilities, the rhythm of observation and attention shaping her awareness like a careful melody. The faint hum of the ventilation system, the distant murmur of traffic, and the soft echo of footsteps across polished floors created a cadence that she instinctively followed, aligning her movements and thoughts with the flow Dominic established. Her gaze swept the room, noting the symmetry of the furniture, the alignment of objects, the subtle layering of light and shadow, and she recognized that every element contributed to a controlled, deliberate atmosphere that demanded mindfulness and presence. Dominic adjusted a small decorative object with quiet precision, the movement almost imperceptible yet carrying intent, and Emma realized that attention to detail, patience, and awareness were inseparable from the influence he exerted, guiding her perception and shaping the environment without overt direction. She exhaled slowly, the cool air against her skin grounding her as she absorbed the subtle lesson of the moment, feeling the space and Dominic's presence intertwine, teaching without words, commanding without force. The city lights outside flickered, fractured, and refracted through the glass, emphasizing the contrast between the controlled interior and the vast, unpredictable world beyond, and Emma felt the tension and curiosity entwine within her, awareness sharpening with each passing moment. Dominic turned slightly, glancing at her with a hint of acknowledgement, and she understood that each micro-expression, each shift of posture, and each moment of observation was part of a continuum, a silent exchange of understanding, presence, and anticipation. Her heartbeat, aligned with the rhythm of the room, subtle yet perceptible, as she realized that being here required her full attention, measured responses, and the ability to perceive beyond what was immediately visible, and that the unfolding night would continue to challenge, guide, and reveal not only the world Dominic navigated, but also her capacity to adapt, observe, and engage with a space and a presence that demanded both insight and patience at every turn. Emma Carter felt the culmination of the night settle around her like a quiet, heavy presence, the city lights outside the towering windows casting fragmented reflections across the polished hardwood floor, blending with the soft glow of the interior lighting. Dominic Romano stood near the large desk, posture straight, movements deliberate, yet there was a subtle ease to the way he navigated the space that conveyed command without tension. She observed him closely, noting the precise alignment of objects, the layering of light and shadow, the gentle hum of the ventilation system, and realized that every detail was a carefully constructed lesson in observation, awareness, and control. "You have begun to understand," he said softly, voice steady, calm, yet filled with an unspoken expectation that hung in the air like a tangible thread connecting them across the room. Emma shifted slightly, the smooth leather beneath her hands grounding her as her mind traced the complex patterns of light, movement, and intent around her, noting how the reflections of the city danced in fractured shapes across polished surfaces, subtly emphasizing perspective, focus, and the importance of measured attention. Her heartbeat quickened with a mixture of anticipation and realization, sensing that the night had been orchestrated not only to introduce her to this environment, but to immerse her in a rhythm of presence, perception, and deliberate choice. Dominic's gaze met hers briefly, ice-blue eyes unwavering, carrying both scrutiny and a faint acknowledgement, and Emma felt the pull of understanding, the subtle lesson embedded in his careful movements, measured words, and the orchestration of the room itself. The soft echo of their steps, the ambient hum of the air system, and the distant murmur of traffic created a layered soundscape that emphasized the contrast between the controlled interior and the sprawling, unpredictable city beyond, drawing her focus inward while keeping her aware of the environment. She inhaled slowly, letting the scent of polished wood and faint cedar fill her senses, grounding her in the present while her mind absorbed the deeper implications of observation, patience, and the interplay of control and response. Dominic adjusted a small decorative element on the desk with precise intention, his fingers barely moving yet commanding attention, and Emma recognized that every subtle cue, every micro-movement, and every intentional gesture contributed to the overarching lesson of awareness and alignment with the rhythm he set. Her thoughts swirled with understanding and curiosity, anticipation threading through her perception as she realized that each choice she made, each subtle observation, and each measured response would shape not only her comprehension of the environment, but also the ongoing dynamic between them. As Dominic turned slightly, acknowledging her attention with a faint, knowing glance, Emma felt the culmination of everything she had learned that night coalesce into a quiet clarity, the weight of the space, the city beyond, and the deliberate presence of Dominic Romano settling into a moment of tense, anticipatory stillness, a prelude to the next chapter of discovery, understanding. and the unfolding rhythm that would guide the hours to come.